Good evening. I'm Tony Jones. Welcome to Q&A's first high school special, live from Docklands in Melbourne. Tonight, an audience made up entirely of high school students, and on the panel, 4 students who won their places by competing against more than 250 video auditioners. So, joining Q&A tonight, rural advocate Jock Maddern from Kaniva College in Western Victoria. Shadow Health Minister Catherine King. Aspiring journalist Pinidu Chandrasekera from Melbourne's Parade College. The first female Prime Minister of the Youth Indigenous Parliament, Aretha Brown of Williamstown High. Environment and Energy Minister Jock Frydenberg. And student activist Jacinta Speer from MacRobertson's Girls High in Melbourne. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now remember, Q&A is live on ABC TV and radio at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time, and you can stream us live on iView, YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Tonight on Q&A, our audience and questioners are all high school students. So what do the leaders of tomorrow want to talk about? Let's find out. Our first question comes from Louis Gordon.
Young people are often viewed as politically disengaged or uninterested people. But when figures such as Bernie Sanders in the USA or Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom emerge, young people can become very influential and engaged. So what can be done to increase political engagement and interest amongst young people in Australia?
Aretha, I think I'll start with you as a former Prime Minister or current Prime Minister. What do you think? What can be done to help engage young people in politics and issues?
Well, at this point, my activism is primarily based on my, being Indigenous and what it means to be an Indigenous person. And I often say this, and this is an opinion that I hold that, a lot of people might not necessarily agree with, but at this point in my life, being a young person, I kind of think that, having identity and, who I think I am, it's not as important as being politically conscious at this point in my life. If I could, date this back to anything, Elaine Brown, who was a former, member of the Black Panthers, she once said that, I'm not waiting around to struggle for someone to find out they're black. And so at this point in my life, I'm trying to realise that, not one single person, not one single enlightened person has ever changed the world. It's always been a dedicated collective of passionate people ready to, for actual change. And so at this point, I'm just trying to, start these political, just kind of having conversations and kind of having these discussions and realising that, it's important to be an individual, but at this point, if you really want to help a struggle or a cause, you got to be, part of a group. And so at this point, I think my identity and who I think I am will kind of catch up with me, so...
Jacinta, what do you think? And just reflect on what the questioner was asking there. 2 old white men, Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, what made them attractive to young voters?
Well, I think what made them attractive to young voters is that they actually took us seriously. They took our voice seriously. I think in the mainstream political discourse, there's often an attempt to minimise young people's problems or their voices. I mean, just look at the smashed Avo debate, yeah? But I think, they've really harnessed the power of young people by giving them a voice, by listening to them, and I think that's why they've been so successful. Let's
hear from Jock, man. What's the view from the bush, Jock?
Well, to be honest, I don't actually reckon there's enough exposure, to rural kids about politics, because I don't reckon there'll be many of my mates that are really that interested in politics, and it's just because, well, you learn about it when you're young, and then you kind of drop off till you're 17. They send you a letter in the mail saying, please enrol to vote next year. So you've got really no idea what you're talking about, really, or what you're voting for, so...
So there's not a lot of political engagement among your peer group, is that what you're saying?
No, I'd say not, no.
Interest in politics at all?
Oh, no, not really.
What about... we'll probably come during the course of the program to some specific issues and see where there's interest around that. Yeah. But let's actually hear from Pinidu. What do you think?
Well, I think what the questioner was talking about in terms of what we saw in America with Bernie Sanders and then in England with Jeremy Corbyn, I think what we saw there was a reactionary to the populist movement that we saw. So we saw Donald Trump being elected in America and then the Brexit in the UK. So what we're seeing here is a reaction to that populist movement. And this resonated amongst younger voters who thought that their ideals and that their motives went better with those candidates. And I think it's quite clear because in America, more younger people voted for Bernie Sanders than those who voted for both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton combined. And in the UK, the exit polls showed that Jeremy Corbyn had 34% more of the younger vote. So I think the main issue I think that caused this was that our generation, so those who were born, say, after 1990, we were kind of born to take the capitalistic system of freedom for granted. We were born into a capitalistic society. We weren't there when there was a battle between socialism and capitalism in the 60s. We weren't there when they fought for economic freedom. And I think we're taking this for granted.
Yep, Catherine King, obviously if politicians are listening to the message that came from the Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, what they call youth quake, is that message being learnt by Australian politicians?
Look, I think it is, and I think the first thing to say is that my experience is that young people are pretty politically engaged. I think that from broad global issues to local issues, and I think part of the job of a local member of parliament is to make sure you're listening, but also that politics is relevant, and that politics isn't something that happens somewhere else, that it's actually part of everyday's life. There'll be politics in your footy club every single day, and that's pretty much we do that on a grander scale. It's really trying to make sure that it's relevant and that we're actually, listening, as Jacinta says, and actually engaging in the issues that matter to people.
Does Bill Shorten, your leader, think he can actually take something from this, take lessons from Corbyn and Sanders? Is he, in fact, trying to be the Australian Corbyn?
I don't think he is. I think Bill's trying to be Bill Shorten, and that's exactly who he is. And I think he's someone who's always been really actively engaged with young people and with standing up for equality and making sure that we're actually listening to people who are disenfranchised at different points in time. So I think Bill Shorten's trying to be nobody else but Bill Shorten, and hopefully, if we're lucky enough to be the Prime Minister of the country.
I also think that being part of certain minority groups, you kind of don't get a choice of going into politics. You're kind of born into it. And you, as an Indigenous person, I know for a fact that politics has changed my family history and everything that I've come to know and respect about a system. On this case, maybe not so much kind of, find attractive about a political system. And I think that we don't always have the option of kind of being involved in it because you are.
You're saying you don't have a choice?
You don't have a choice at all because you don't get a choice. It's kind of a privilege, I think, to kind of want to be interested in politics when someone who is Indigenous kind of is, for so long kind of been, I guess, kind of controlled by it.
Josh Frydenberg, what do you think, and listening to this, do you see a kind of youth quake coming at the next election, and are you prepared for it as a government?
Well, I don't think anyone's really prepared for it until, such a major transformation occurs. But I think young people today are more engaged, more empowered than any previous equivalent generation. And I think the reason why is because of the improvements in communication. They're more connected than ever before. Now, this is a whole new opportunity for young people because they can have an impact, they can have their voice heard. And for politicians, this is also a great opportunity too because we can tap the ideas from young people. And I think we can't ignore it, but at the same time we should resist that siren song of just wanting to promise everything to the younger people because we believe that's what they want to hear. I think we need to take them on the journey and work together with mutual respect.
Josh, our questioner Louis Gordon's got his hand up. I'll just quickly go back to Louis. Quick comment, Louis.
Yeah. Do you think do you think an alternative figure such as Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn could emerge in Australia?
Well, I certainly think that there are elements of
You certainly hope not on the Labor side, right, Josh?
Well, I think there are elements of their agenda that will make its way into the parliamentary debate. But I think we have to be very careful because what Bernie Sanders was promising, was abolish university debts, and we saw from Jeremy Corbyn similar unfunded promises. And this is where the rubber hits the road for governments, that they have to be fiscally responsible, but they also, need to put huge priorities on the things that matter to young people, whether it's education, health, housing affordability or the like. So,
Josh, I'm going to interrupt
right
there because we've got to get through quite a few questions tonight. We'll take the next one. It's from Cameron Warasta.
In the 2016 federal election, I was out there fundraising, door knocking, handing out how to vote cards, phone banking, and encouraging people to vote for the party I was campaigning for. However, all of this was despite the fact that I wasn't able to vote myself because I was only 16 years old. Is it time to lower the voting age to boost youth engagement in Australian politics?
Let's hear from our young panellists first. Pinidu, what do you think?
Well, I think in terms of the age, I think that the change for that must come through our education system. We're all students in here. I'm sure we've been in a classroom where there's always been that one student, while the teacher's going on about parabolic functions, he puts his hand up and says, Mr. or Mrs., what are we going to do with this in everyday life? And we all have to agree. So I think the change has to come through our education system. And I know your question was about political involvement, but I think there's three things overall, including political involvement. So there's political involvement. I think there needs to be more awareness of our legal system, as well as more financial literacy. And these three things, I think, work together to incentivise for students to have more engagement with the real world.
You think 16-year-olds should get the vote, is at the core of that question?
Yeah, I think they should get it if we can adjust our curriculum so they can get involved in politics and learn about it at a younger age, so that when they're 16, they are more prepared to make informed decisions.
Aretha?
In my opinion, I kind of have to disagree with it. I think that, I can't speak for everyone, but I'm kind of happy with the age, that we're entitled to vote. I think that before, like I said, you're going to have to be politically conscious and you have to know exactly what you want to kind of, vote for, who you're voting for, why you're voting for them before you do it. And not to say that people who are younger don't have the capability to kind of make that conscientious decision, but at the same time realising that, I don't know, I think it's something that comes with a great deal of responsibility. And I think we all kind of, have the capability to, be able to vote at 16, but at the same time, I just think that, I don't know, I think it's something that we should wait.
Jacinta, what do you think?
I think that I'm not sure that it's that important that we vote at 16. I mean, we've got the rest of our lives ahead of us in terms of voting. But I think what is important is youth engagement in politics from a very young age. So what you talked about, campaigning, going out the door knocking, that's exactly the kind of action we need, because it allows us to really gain insights into the political system and it helps us really make informed choices. So I think maybe rather than making the age limit 16, the government should be trying to implement more political awareness within the youth by listening to their concerns, by addressing their concerns, by having, like panels like this one, where we really get to address ourselves in the broader debate.
And Jock, what do you think? I know that you said that not a lot of your friends are politically engaged. How do you feel about the 16-year-olds amongst them getting the vote?
Yeah, well, I reckon it should probably stay at 18, but I also agree with Pinidu, like, it could be lowered to 16, but the education about the politics and how it works would have to be upgraded and the foundation level boosted up. And especially if you're given it at 16, you're about to enter, well, for most people, VCE, you're about to enter a really stressful time in your life. And having all those extra worries about who you're going to vote for, what they're saying and all that, I don't reckon it's just added pressure when it isn't needed. So I reckon stick it at 18 for now.
Right, I think that wisdom means we don't have to go to the politicians. Let's move to Dylan Shooter for the next question so we can get more. Go ahead.
My question is directed towards Mr. Frydenberg. With millennial Australians being the first generation in our history to not out-earn our parents, as well as the skyrocketing prices of both housing and university, how can the government effectively foster a future where we, as young Australians, can realise the same lives that our parents lived?
Josh, a very big question, and one that's the heart of the whole intergenerational inequity thing. What do you say?
Well, I mean, the good news, and I would like to look at this question from a glass half full perspective, the good news for everyone in this room is that the Australian economy is growing. In fact, we've grown under Liberal and Labor governments. We are in our 26th consecutive year of economic growth, and we're the envy of most countries in the world for that. So the pie is getting bigger, but it's our job to ensure that people in this audience, when they get into the housing market, they do have a chance to earn their home, and no doubt that's getting out of reach for a lot of people. That you have a quality education system, whether it's at school or at university, and that, for the issues that are important to you, like the environment, and I engage with a lot of young people in my portfolio, that you actually, get the outcomes that you're seeking for not just your generation, but for future generations. So a lot of work's being done. A lot of it is bipartisan, I have to say, and I think that's important. But to say that we're going backwards is not right. In fact, we're growing as an economy, and there is a good story to tell for you and your generation.
So quickly just go back to our question of Dylan. Do you actually see this as a big problem? And do you buy what the government is telling you here?
I think that if what Mr. Frydenberg is saying is true, perhaps he could answer why it has consistently been Liberal governments that have shut down things such as Gonski, which was to improve education, and why it was also the Liberal government under John Howard who cut the capital gains tax, which has caused the current housing affordability crisis. So if these things are important to the Liberal government, why aren't they acting like it?
Okay. Josh, he's put you on the spot there, but I'm going to ask that you keep your answer brief so we can hear from our other panellists.
Well, we're very proud of the fact that we've just passed the new education funding package, which is a $23 billion increase. And that when it comes to housing affordability, the answer is not just at the federal level, the answer is also at the state and local level. And there are a huge number of initiatives that we've done to increase supply of housing, including 6,000 new homes here in Victoria and in Maribyrnong through Defence Land we'll be releasing, but also for superannuation. For the first time, people in this audience will be able to save for their first housing deposit through their superannuation. So we are doing lots of innovative things.
Jacinta, you've been listening to this, and the intergenerational inequity does seem to be a huge issue. What do you think?
Well, I'm sorry. I think it's great to see it as a glass half full approach, but we've got to address the other empty half of the glass. I mean, we're facing some of the biggest problems. The disappearance of the intergenerational bargain, right? The idea that I can have a future that's better than my parents is gone. I mean, you touched on housing affordability, but also education in terms of university, tertiary funding, and all these other issues. I just feel like our voices are not being listened to when it comes to climate change, when it comes to all these issues that will affect our generation the most, and yet they're being decided on by people who are significantly out of our age bracket. I mean, look at Brexit. It was the same thing. People in the highest age group, or up there, deciding the future of the rest of us.
It's true what you're saying. Young people voted almost diametrically the opposite on the Brexit vote to elderly people, and I suppose that is a big problem across democracies. Pinidu, what do you think?
Now, in regards to education especially, I think it's very easy to blame the government for this and say they need to fund more, they need to throw more money. Throwing more money at the problem isn't just going to solve it. Now, if we look at tertiary education in particular, which Josh mentioned before, 1 in 5, on average, in Australia, university students don't complete their course. Now, it's not just up to the government to throw money at us. We need to develop an attitude of resilience to keep going, and we need to make sure that we get around our peers instead of always trying to get more money thrown at the education sector. And in terms of the other part of the question regarding housing affordability, I think also the government has also had to face new issues. We've had a rapidly rising population. We've had an ageing population. Baby boomers are becoming the largest portion of our society. So it's not as clear-cut an issue that is to solve.
Does it worry you that baby boomers seem to own all the assets in the country, including most of the housing and most of the investment housing?
Well, I think the baby boomers do make up a large portion of our population, so it is not as if they're taking something from us. And I think what we're seeing in the housing affordability crisis is the incentives provided in Scott Morrison's budget before, it did bring it down a correction. So there was a report released by Business Insiders earlier today, and basically what it said was the housing price market has actually gone down by 0.1% in the past week. So those little incentives, as Alan Finkel likes to describe it, carrots and sticks. And these are sorts of things we can use to manipulate the economy. So what Scott Morrison did by, giving younger first home buyers a leg up, and also while providing incentives for foreign investors, making it a bit more difficult for them to invest. These sorts of incentives can sort of combine into one policy. It's not just a clear-cut solution.
Aretha, what do you think?
At this point, it's not something that I've really thought about, because it's... The thing about these kinds of issues is because it's not necessary that we... When we talk about housing affordability and things like this, I think the language we use around it, we're always talking about the future and future generations and baby boomers, and we're using these kind of vocabulary that, it's long in the future, and because we can't actually see it and because it's not affecting us right now, it almost seems like it's not important, or that it's, not an issue that we should address today, when obviously it's something that we should. But this is, what I'm saying is we kind of need to change the language around it. At this point, I haven't got a real opinion on it, but what I do know is that it's obviously something that everyone's very, passionate about.
Jock, what do you think?
Well, I think housing affordability, it really depends on when you are. Like, here in Melbourne, understandably it's going to be a lot more expensive than in Kaniva, but there's still houses out there if you want to buy them, and you may have to sacrifice the location where you want to live. But if you want a house, there are houses out there that are affordable.
You mean out in rural and regional Australia?
Yeah, heaps of them out there, and heaps of them are very affordable. And life wasn't...
I suppose someone might say, well, that's okay for you, Jock, because you live on a farm and you might inherit the farm one day or something like that. But what about other kids living out there who can't find jobs?
Well, life wasn't meant to be easy. Like, if it was meant to be easy, everyone would be good at it. And it's certainly not good that people can't straight away get into the housing market.
Did you know that a former rural Victorian Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, once said that?
Yeah. But it's not good that young people can't get straight into the housing market, but there's a reason for that. It's because it always has gone up, and people... I know it's harder to get jobs still, but, like, that's the whole idea, to get a job, to work hard, then to save up, then buy the house, and then have the family, and then have the Australian dream. Like, it was never meant to be easy, and it's still achievable for those who work hard.
And the dream can happen in Kaniva.
Yeah,
just
definitely.
As well. Make that point. Catherine?
Yeah, look, I think governments are very powerful in this space, and I think the question went right to the heart of that. What is government doing to actually make sure the policy settings are right to try and make it easier for people to be able to young people to be able to get into the housing market? And we know that those settings currently are not right. We went to the election with a proposal, obviously, around negative gearing and capital gains tax to try and actually skew the market back towards first home buyers and to young people. We still have that on the table, encouraging the government to try and actually start to take some of that up. But this is a real area of inequality. And if we don't deal with it, we are going to have more and more young people who are not able to get into the housing market, who are not able to get jobs after graduating from university if they can get there in the first place. And government settings and government investment matters in this space.
All right, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda, and keep an eye on our Twitter account, RMIT ABC Fact Check, and the Conversation website for the results. Now, the next question comes from Sasha Pollock.
Commercial television media labelled my town Bundoora one of the worst areas for dole bludging. We are encouraged to stay in Bundoora to go to uni and make our town prosper. But how do we stay when there are so few job opportunities? Is it a coincidence that Bundoora's electorate of Mallee is the safest national seat in the country, and the federal and state governments continue to ignore the need for assistance with huge unemployment, youth suicide and ice addiction issues?
Yeah, Jock, Maddern, that's the story of Bundoora, but is it familiar to you?
Oh, not as much, I feel, but I feel the reason that there's not much change is because sometimes in safer seats in electorates, there's no need, well, I shouldn't say there's no need, everyone needs to be looked after still, but if it's safe, there really isn't any need to have expenditure there to gain voters for that party. And really, if it's really, really safe, the opposition aren't going to invest there because it's going to take a lot to try and swing the vote. So it would be good to see change, and yeah, well, it needs to change to get more employment for youth.
Does it mean it'd be a good idea to get rid of a few National Party MPs and replace them with some other party? Is that independence, perhaps? Definitely not?
Nah, keep the Nationals.
Catherine King.
Well, I think look, I've got a pretty firm view. I think as a country MP myself, I don't think the Nationals, I think it's a long, long way since the National Party have actually represented the interests of country people. I think that they have really, really frankly been in bed with the coalition for such a long period of time. They're not actually representing the area. I mean, Bundoora is a fantastic place. It is a really terrific place to grow up, and I think that it's important that you don't have media stigmatising any area, frankly. And I think that, working with local government, working with state governments, and hopefully working with friendly federal governments, there is lots you can do in communities like Bundoora. But it is a pretty rich ask when unemployment is where it is, and there's lots of economic development opportunities that are needed out in your area, and the Nats need to, frankly, do a lot better by country areas.
Aretha, you've lived in both worlds, regional Australia and now in Melbourne. Mm-hmm. Where do you think the best opportunities are for young people?
Obviously it's the city, but that's a problem in itself. From that question, the one kind of term that I picked up on was dole bludging, and for being part of the Aboriginal community, it's something that time and time again is, we kind of thrown this idea that, as an Indigenous person, you get things free from the government, and you don't have to work hard for what you got. You rely on, certain welfare, statures, I guess. And what I kind of think about that is, obviously we need to empower people in these certain towns where they don't feel the need to kind of, I don't know, not so much not rely on certain welfare kind of facilities, but at the same time not feel guilty about it either, because you kind of have to realise that quick cures don't cure diseases, they prolong them, and so at this point you kind of have to realise that being a dull bludger, whatever that means, whatever the term means, there shouldn't be any shame in it, because people do rely on kind of welfare, and the people that do rely on welfare are often from these kind of communities or country, regional parts of the world. And unfortunately, this is something that we have to deal with. We have to realise it's not a disadvantage at all, and something not to kind of.
You're saying where there aren't as many opportunities to get work.
Exactly, and there shouldn't be guilt that comes along with it, especially stigmatised by the media.
Josh Frydenberg.
Well, I don't think people, either in Mildura or in this audience, are interested in political sledging. They're interested in solutions. And the solution for the unemployed are through programs like the PATH program, which is about preparing young people under the age of 24, in some cases from 15 to 24, with the right skills to get into the workforce, then allowing them to be trialled within a business and an internship. And recently the Retailers Association, the Hotels Association, the Motor Traders Association came together and said we're going to create 20,000 internships for those young people, and then getting them hired on a full-time basis, with the government providing up to $10,000 as an incentive. They're real solutions that apply in the regional areas, and I don't take this argument that just because it's a safe seat for the National Party, the Liberals or the Labor Party or whoever, that the local member is not trying as hard as they possibly can to get a good a leg up for the people in their own electorate.
Now, Josh, I'm just going to interrupt you there, because we actually have a question on the PATH project, the PATH policy. It's from Joshua Monaghan. Joshua. Sorry, we'll just find where you are. There you go, Joshua. Thank you.
So the government's PATH program subsidises employers to hire young people at less than minimum wage. How is that any better than a government agency that could directly give jobs to young people and pay them at least minimum wage?
Well, the key to the PATH program is actually to get young people in the door. So that actual trial program is an internship where they're getting their income support, because these are for young people who've been on income support, plus an extra $200. And then once they get into the job, and that's what we're paying up to $10,000 to employers to do, then they will get a good wage from then on. So what we have found with young people, and by the way, our youth unemployment rate is at 12.7%, which is too high, right? It's double the national average for people of an older age bracket. And so therefore we need to get them in their foot in the door, and this has proven to be a good program.
OK, now, Jacinta.
Well, I actually think this PATH program is really problematic. I mean, I think it's going to lead to this sort of churn culture where employers can get free interns, in fact get paid by the government for it, over and over again without actually having to pay for them. I think the problem is not only youth unemployment, but youth underemployment, that is, being involved in part-time or casual jobs. And I think that this is only going to contribute to that.
Josh, I'll come back to you on that. Let's hear from Catherine King, because the Labor Party has a strong position on this.
Yeah, look, we think that this program is potentially really exploitative of young people. I mean, here you have a government who has basically allowed the cutting of penalty rates. So you've got 700,000 young people and other people in fairly marginalised workplaces already having their wages cut. You've then decided to introduce a program that has no protections particularly in place for young people, doesn't protect against exploitation, and frankly doesn't necessarily lead to full-time work. I mean, if the issue is underemployment of young people, then it's about creating jobs and meaningful jobs for young people that pay proper wages, not less wages than the minimum wage.
Thank you, Catherine. Let's go quickly back to our question, Joshua. Joshua.
I asked how it was better than a government agency like something that the US had to deploy during the New Deal. And since the Liberal Party is, I think, a party dedicated to the free market, why is it a more free market solution to bribe employers to hire young people than to give them jobs yourself give them experience and then let them go out to private enterprises with that experience when their turn at the government job is up.
Right, now I don't think you can expect Josh Frydenberg to be a champion of Roosevelt's New Deal, often considered by Conservatives to be socialist. Josh?
Look, 87% of jobs for everyone in this audience will be created by the private sector. That's the reality of where we are today. So we need to incentivise the private sector to get young people into the door. Now, this program has already been taken up with vigour by, like I said, major employer organisations. Now, of course, the unions have opposed it because it wasn't their idea, but the reality is they've been prepared to take interns in their own, into their own offices. The Labor Party takes interns into their offices. Why aren't we able to get interns into employers' offices and building sites as we are doing
Josh.
now?
Thank you. Let's hear from the other side of the panel. Pinidu.
Oh, yeah, and I think going back to the question before from Sasha, it's not just youth unemployment that's a problem. In these communities, we're seeing multiple factors combining into one economic storm, we could say. You've got youth unemployment, you've got industry that's collapsing, and you've got problems with jobs, and which also get reflected in the education sector. Take Elizabeth, for example, in South Australia, with the closure of manufacturing there, that has a ripple effect on the community. So I think just by creating jobs won't necessarily fix the solution. We need to provide a long-term incentive. Now, going back to what Josh was saying, I think the PATH program is a way to get in the door, and it's not necessarily going to, it might not guarantee a position, but getting them in there, getting them in that environment and giving them that experience, that is vital. Experience is a very vital thing in the labour industry. Now, what we saw recently, when the Turnbull government got rid of the 457 visas, we saw an example in the IT industry where they were outraged because they get most of their employees from this program. And we actually heard from a couple of Australian employees, young Australians, out in Silicon Valley. And what they're saying is that they're working for big companies, Apple and the likes, these big tech companies over in the US. And they're saying they're working in the US, but they would much love to have a job back home. But every time they apply at home, they get denied for not having experience. So experience is really undervalued in our labour market.
Yeah, Jock, what do you think? Pretty simple. You can get an internship. The government will pay the employer some money, use some money. You won't get the standard wage. Is it a good idea or not?
I reckon it's a bad idea, to be honest. Like, I don't see the need for any subsidising and any funding for all that. Young kids have got to want to work. There are jobs out there, doesn't matter what it is. There will be jobs out there. It could just be sweeping a floor at a factory or something. There is jobs out there. If people want them, they can find them. And then no matter how little it is, that banks up as experience. And then you can move up, get more experience. And then all of a sudden you've got the experience to qualify for the job you actually want. So there would be work out there. It's just a matter of wanting to do it and wanting to get that experience.
OK, we're hearing a range of strong opinions. We've got other subjects to talk about. Let's go to our next question from David Trevorrow.
The new Super Ministry for Home Affairs is meant to make us feel safer. But with a lack of judicial oversight, reduced accountability and unprecedented power given to one person, how can we trust it?
Jacinta, that one person will be Peter Dutton.
I think it's part of a worrying trend towards like the centralisation of power, which I always think is a bad idea in a democracy. I mean, the government sort of not provided any real data on how this move will be good for the intelligence agencies. It's been, expert opinion, which I think is really worrying because it seems like this is something of an internal political move to soothe over tensions in the Liberal Party rather than an actual legitimate home security concern.
Josh, we've heard that critique and it's a pretty powerful one. Why do we need this super ministry?
Well, firstly, you've seen a super ministry like this in the United Kingdom called the Home Office, and the Prime Minister recently consulted with Prime Minister Theresa May, and we have been consulting with the relevant security intelligence agencies. We also had a comprehensive review into intelligence by Michael Lestrange, a former senior diplomat, who said that such a move through the machinery of government is actually logical. And the former head of ASIO, David Irvine, has also been very supportive of the move. What we need to do is get an integrated approach to border protection issues, to intelligence, which comes primarily at the domestic level from ASIO, and from law enforcement, which is the Australian Federal Police. We have been very successful to date in recent years. Since 2014, the country and our intelligence and law enforcement agencies have prevented 12 purported attacks. And so the threat is real, but we believe that having an integrated policy-making and strategic approach will be beneficial.
Is it odd to you, Josh, that even former Prime Minister Tony Abbott seems to be questioning the necessity for doing this?
Well, Tony Abbott obviously has a different view on a number of things. Well,
especially who should be Prime Minister, I suspect.
Well, look, you know, Tony has made those views clear, obviously, in lots of different areas. And but in terms of the professional opinion about what we're doing, there are a number of very senior voices who are supportive of it, and obviously I think Peter Dutton's proven in this area.
Well, let's hear from the other panellists. Pinidu.
Well, I think overall this Home Affairs Ministry is designed to make our border security more streamlined. We have ASIO, the Australian Federal Police, they're all working together. That's it, that's the outline of this deal. They're all in one super ministry because they want to link up the dots. They want nothing to fall through. Like if we look at the US, you've got the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security. It's such a wide and intricate, complex network that there's always a chance that one vital piece of intelligence may fall through. And now what we're doing here is we're streamlining it. And we're making sure that nothing falls through. Everything goes up properly through the chain of command. And we're not just dealing with intelligence here. We're dealing with national security, cyber security. We're dealing with national issues which may potentially put the lives of Australians at risk. So it's very important that all these agencies are connected and they're all working collaboratively and in a streamlined way to make sure that Australia is as safe as possible.
Catherine King, do you accept that? Does the Labor Party accept that?
Well, I think
that kind of notion, because it's...
I think the first thing is that, you know, the only reason for doing something like this has to be for national security. We've asked for briefings, as is our right in opposition. The government hopefully will have as forthcoming. This should not be for political reasons, and I think there is some cynicism, given the current state of play within the Liberal Party, that this is for political reasons. I think there are some serious questions around the constitutionality, the separation of powers and judicial review, and it will be absolutely incumbent on the government to prove that this is necessary for security reasons, not just for political reasons. It's a very, very big call to have made.
OK, we'll go to a related question. It's from Sondas Samak.
Will ASIO have more powers to monitor young Muslims like me, viewing us through the prism of terrorism, criminalise me if I post something political on social media? Do I have the freedom of speech like everyone else?
Aretha, what do you think about that?
In my opinion, you have the right to kind of you have the right to stand up and face the world, like you have the right to be there, and you have the right to stand up and criticise the world, and you have the right to post whatever the hell you want. And at this point, if there's certain organisations that might intimidate you or feel as though that you haven't got the right to say what you want to say, then I honestly don't think it can be for the best. And obviously, I can't speak for the Muslim community because I'm not Muslim, but at the same time, you have to realise that you have rights. These are not needs, these are rights. And, if you can't say what you want to say, then I don't think anyone else should be able to either.
Jock, what do you think?
I think it's a pretty fine line. Like, we want to have, like Pinidu said, we don't want anything falling through the gaps, anything going unnoticed that could risk lives and just infrastructure here in Australia. But then you also don't want to be, I don't know, alienating certain populace from the population, like Sondas over there, and the Muslim community. It's unfair to alienate them, especially saying they aren't the ones causing the fear, they aren't the ones stirring up this hysteria. So, yeah, it's a very fine line.
Jacinta?
Well, I don't think ASIO should be, putting more monitoring on Muslims. I think they should be protecting them, like all Australians. And I think, obviously there's a certain demographic that's most vulnerable to extremist propaganda, and we should have like more education systems and mental health services available to the most vulnerable young people so they don't become targets for extremism. And I think that's a much better way to go if we really want to fight for national security, rather than marginalising a certain group of our population just because of their religion.
Josh, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is there are very important legal checks and balances in place. So warrants can only be approved by the Attorney General, even under this new measure, and of course having a very close working relationship with the Muslim community is vital. I remember when 9/11 happened, the then Australian Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, was speaking to his Indonesia counterpart, and his counterpart said that the hijackers on 9/11 didn't just hijack a plane, they hijacked his religion. And I think the point was that these extremists don't speak for all Muslims, and that's absolutely critical. So your right to be an Australian and participate in our society is equal to anyone up on this panel or anyone in the Parliament. But we have to be very realistic about the threat we face. This is why the Muslim community is a partner in what we're trying to do, and having those legal checks and balances is critical for all of us.
So can I just come back to you? Do you accept the arguments you're hearing up here? Or do you actually feel like your freedom of speech is in danger?
Well, I feel like the government, it puts all of these measures to protect us, but at the same time it is marginalising the Muslim community, and we can feel that in everywhere that we go. Like, why do I on the street have to feel like I'm a subject for Islamophobia, even though my government's telling me that I'm safe to go out, but just because I'm wearing my headscarf, I can easily be targeted, and I have the right to feel as safe as everyone else in this country, but I don't feel as safe as everyone else in this country is.
Pinidu, what do you think about that? And does it distress you to hear that someone doesn't feel safe?
Well, Sanders, I don't think you hearing about these new changes and have ASIO having more powers need to be worried that that impinges on the Muslim community in any way, shape or form. ASIO is out there to get extremists, and they have reasons and they have a protocol that they follow. They have steps that they follow, and these are national security threats. If they have increased powers, there is nothing to suggest that this will impinge on the rights or the freedom of speech of a certain minority in our population. And on your point regarding freedom of speech, I think you're always out, you can say what you want. And sometimes what we say might come back with criticism, but that's also another element of freedom of speech. Anything that we say, we might get criticised for it, but freedom of speech goes both ways.
But yeah, I also think the fact that her question stated that, she doesn't feel, that she can post things online without getting criticism. But you have to realise it's not, ASIO or security services, disliking what she has to say on social media. It's the general public, and it's what, us as a people, think about what a young Muslim girl is writing, and it's how certain security measures affect our opinion on a certain community, and I think that should be acknowledged.
I think we're mixing up a couple of elements here, and the thing is, like Aretha, you mentioned that there's what she can say in terms of her freedom of speech, and then there's you bring in ASIO, and I think there's two separate spheres. What she says online, and if she gets targeted for it, that's something to do with the general public.
But it's how ASIO itself implementing these, targeting or looking at certain demographics of people influences how the public thinks they can treat certain demographics of people, particularly the Muslim community.
But ASIO doesn't release what figures of who they're targeting. This is done by the media, and I think we're getting confused here. ASIO's work should never be confused with the media
and certain politicians.
Yes, I guess you could say that, but ASIO is a security agency.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Catherine King, briefly, because we've got to move on.
Yep, sure. I mean, as a citizen of this country, you have every right to the same rights and the responsibilities as everybody else, and it is really distressing to hear that you do not feel that you're safe, or that you feel that you're being targeted, because that is racism, and it's really important that we call that out when that happens, and it's important that when politicians make comments that are racist, that we say that that's what they are, and we stand up for you, because you deserve MPs to stand up for you in exactly the same way as we would anybody else who's being racially discriminated against.
Thank you, and remember you can join the discussion on Twitter and on Q&A Extra on Facebook Live and ABC News Radio straight after this program. Now, our next question comes from Tilda Stevens.
The suicide rate among young Australians is at a 10-year high, but it seems that mental health problems are being glamorised in the media. For example, 13 Reasons Why portrays suicide as almost acceptable. Is the government doing enough to combat this sort of media influence?
Jacinta, I'll start with you. 13 Reasons Why. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have actually. I think Yeah, there is this very fine line. On one side...
We should just explain, first of all, what it is.
I will.
It's a drama, so tell us briefly what happens.
So it's about this girl who decides to take her own life, and then she leaves behind these series of video cassettes that pass from person to person explaining why she decided to take her life. And I think there's this fine line between glamorising suicide and between raising awareness of it. So while I did think that the show was fantastic in how it depicted how one event and then another can really, these seemingly trivial events can lead to a collapse. I think at the same time it went too far in its actual depiction of the suicide, and I think there should be some sort of guidelines in place or some kind of public awareness around, you know, what is appropriate for the public sphere and what isn't.
Aretha, what do you think?
I know that I can speak for the mob when I say this, but, you know, Indigenous people are 4 times more likely to commit suicide, especially in, you know, remote communities. It's almost kind of a normalised thing, and it's programs like this that kind of not necessarily endorse it, but like you said, it does romanticise it. But the only thing that I can kind of, you know, get out of this is that we don't need stronger Indigenous people. We don't need stronger non-Indigenous people. We just need to kind of, you know, we need to change the way that the society perceives strength in this kind of circumstance. I think that, you know, mental illness for young people is something that we talk about, you know, all the time, but in a lot of these rural Indigenous communities and, you know, just rural towns itself, there's just not any kind of mental health services available for young people. They're not accessible, and with the Aboriginal community, there's almost a great deal of shame that comes with, you know, feeling, you know, these certain ways. And it's programs like this that kind of anger me because they don't represent who I am, and I kind of think that, I don't know, that they don't really do anything but spark kind of spite.
Jock, what do you think? There's rural Australia, as well as Indigenous Australia in rural communities, there has been sort of an epidemic or a spike in suicide. It's a terrible thing. How do you see it from your perspective?
Well, I see it as the hardest thing about mental illness, it seems, and what's been told, is not accepting you've got it, but being able to talk to someone about it, and especially in isolated areas. Like if you live on a farm 50 kilometres from the nearest population or centre, you're going to feel isolated, you're going to feel like you can't talk to anyone and you can't get that assistance. And that's why I feel that in rural areas the suicide rates are high, just because of pure isolation. They feel like no one's around them, there is no one there to talk to, and I feel like that's why sometimes the rates are higher. Is it because government agencies are not there when people need them? I reckon it's that, but just the pure distances and the isolation, like it takes enough courage to talk to someone about a mental illness as it is, but then the whole, if you're all alone, you've then got to have the courage to drive all the way, find maybe the closest GP, which could be even further than that, and then sit down and have the conversation, and then you've still got to go back to where you live and try and implement what they're saying, and I think it's just very tough to do.
I also think that you could have the best mental health kind of programs out there, and the best teachers and the best doctors and psychiatrists and all that kind of stuff, but unless it's accessible for everybody within these rural communities, it's irrelevant. And I think that something that I've seen a lot living in some of this, you know, up north and in communities where there are large Indigenous populations is, if you have a mental, you know, illness or, you know, something in that kind of spectrum, and you want to go to a doctor and you want to go to a psychiatrist, you want to have a level of kind of trust, and you want to kind of have a level of kind of reliability in them. And what I see is in a lot of these rural towns and communities is you have doctors and psychiatrists, they'll come and they'll get their minimum training and they'll get their experience there, but then they'll leave and go back to the city. And so it's almost like this kind of cycle, and there's no kind of real set kind of elements to it, I guess. And what I kind of want to see is we need to get these communities to kind of be empowered in that sense and get their own mental health kind of programs running, and we shouldn't have to rely on people from the city to kind of go out there and teach people when we can have people out there teach themselves.
Catherine King, what do you think? And just link this, if we can, to the report suggesting that the teen generation that we see now is the most depressed in the nation's history. These are reports that have come from various studies.
Sure. For the first thing, I haven't actually seen the program, and it would concern me if you had a program that was had gone to the levels of which Jacinta has talked about. I think that there's an issue around discussion around suicide versus, in fact, glamorising it, and I think that's a real boundary that program makers have to be very, very careful of. Young people at this generation, mental health is a significant health issue. We've got a lot of work to do in destigmatising it. It should be exactly the same as if you've got any other health issue, that you should be able to access the services you need and you should be able to access evidence-based treatments. And our mental health system at the moment is broken. That is not what happens. It's not what happens in country areas. It's not what happens in outer metro and city areas. We've got a lot of work to do to actually put the services in place, but actually integrate those services into so that they are part of our mainstream health service. And it's something I think the government's done some good work on. We've seen the expansion of headspace facilities across the country, but there is a huge amount of work to do, and this is really an epidemic that is got well and truly beyond us already, and it's not something that we should tolerate. We shouldn't be losing young people.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. We are sort of running short. Now, Josh, I know you want to get into this. There's been figures that suggest that 22.8% of 15 to 19-year-olds are exhibiting serious mental illness. Now, if 1/5 of young people in Australia were suffering from cancer, it would be a national emergency. Why isn't it?
Well, I think it is a major, major issue, and I agree with Catherine that we do need to destigmatise it, and I think the work that Julia Gillard's now doing with Beyond Blue and Jeff Kennett before her is a good example of where bipartisanship can really make a difference. I think we need access to the best available services, and one of the things that we're now doing as a government is telehealth, so that we're using video conferencing and the like to get access to psychologists and other appropriate services to people in regional areas, and I think that's very important. And then finally, I think it's about building coping skills. Now, it's about coping skills not just once you've got depression or you're dealing with a drug addiction or the pressure of high school, but it's actually dealing with it beforehand. And that starts in our schools and building a level of resilience, which I think our educators need to focus on.
All right, we're running out of time. We've got to get as many questions as we can. We had so many good ones. There's another question from Ramisa Bouya, different subject.
A UN climate change study has reported that the Great Barrier Reef will not exist by the end of the century. On top of all this, the new Adani project that the government has approved involves dumping 5 million tonnes of dredge spoil into the reef. Despite the obvious environmental effects that this can have on a World Heritage Site valued at $56 billion, the federal government is planning to loan Adani's project $1 billion loans. Is Australia really going to trust Adani with the Great Barrier Reef, especially with the company's dodgy past?
Now, Josh, I know this is your area, but I want to hear from our young panellists first. Jacinta.
I think the government is really behind the political discourse on this one. I mean, climate change is such an important issue to young people. And I think, when they're going forward with proposals such as the Adani coal mine, it's really disheartening because it feels like our voices are not being heard, and there's this disconnect between what the political elite feel and what we as ordinary people, especially young people, feel. This is an issue that's going to affect not just my generation, but also generations to come. And I think we really need to be thinking long-term rather than short-term and focusing on the impacts in the future.
Pinidu.
You mentioned how Adani doesn't have a very good history with these sorts of things, and I think this is the sort of problem that we can fix with stricter government intervention. If we're going to loan out the money for this project to go ahead, then it should come up with a set of conditions. And these conditions will be not to, as you say, dump wastage into the Great Barrier Reef. And I think one of the views that we haven't raised here yet is we've got us. We're younger people, we're talking about climate change, and we're thinking that the government doesn't really support that. But we also need to think about the views of the people in the local area. And if they want this mine to go ahead, then we need to work in a way that we can get these jobs to these areas, as well as ensuring, as you said, the spillage that is avoided, because that is a very big issue, the Great Barrier Reef.
Do you think, are you talking about a trade-off here between possible threats to the climate or the environment and jobs?
I think there's always that trade-off, and I think that's very much undervalued here. We always forget that. And I think with stricter government intervention, if we, as I said, if we loan out this money for the project to go ahead, but have a set of conditions which Adani must abide to, then that rules out, it doesn't matter what their history was. They will have to have these set of conditions if they are to operate in Australia.
Let's quickly hear from Ramisa. You've listened to two completely different views on the subject here, or at least opposing views to some degree. What do you think?
Well, there are, surrounding the Great Barrier Reef, traditional owners who have already protested against Adani's group. And they have persuaded banks to reject any loans that they can give to the project. So basically what they're saying is, well, mostly the government's saying that the economic benefits reap the environment, but obviously do we really want to risk the Great Barrier Reef, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world? Do we really want to risk something like that, or do you just want to make more money?
Aretha, some traditional owners have opposed the mine, some supported it because of jobs. It's a trade-off.
I kind of think that at the end of the day, if you are kind of denying the fact that Adani could, have long-term, negative effects, then you're discrediting a kind of a whole generation of Indigenous peoples, and you're also discrediting, climate refugees. And believe it or not, because the new proposed mine is going to be implemented, a lot of people do actually have to move off their lands, and it's kind of something that is, number one, total, it's not on, but number two, you have to realise that Indigenous people have such a close kind of connection to land and to environment, and post-colonisation, and today Indigenous people are some of the best botanists and environmentalists, and so totally engrossed in their awareness about the environment that you kind of have to realise that if we want to have these discussions, then you need First Nations people on board, and so that's all I can kind of say.
Josh.
Well, Adani went through the strictest state and federal environmental processes, so much so that the 300 regulations and restrictions that were put in place. Adani is 300 kilometres inland in a dry, dusty bowl of Queensland. Now, the question, therefore, is, should we not, as a country, export coal? And I would put to you that we should be exporting coal, because it's not only our second largest export, providing huge export income for us, but also that Australia's coal is lower in sulphur and lower in ash than other countries, and were we not to provide that coal, then other countries would fill the void. Now, the issue about climate change in the reef is an absolute critical one. Climate change is the #1 threat to the Great Barrier Reef. I was pleased that recently the UNESCO World Heritage Committee that looked at the reef didn't put it on the endangered watch list. That being said, we are working closely across political lines, across state and federal jurisdictions, on a $2 billion package to try to breed the resilience of the reef. So we take climate change absolutely critical, but we can't sell out regional communities who are involved in coal, because it's not simply a question of closing down that mine and not seeing it pop up somewhere else.
Does burning coal make global warming worse? Quick question.
Coal is high in CO2 emissions, and the way to reduce the impact of climate change is to reduce the overall carbon footprint. But what the environment is interested in is not whether it comes from coal or from a vehicle. It's worried about the overall amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So from a government's perspective, we have to have an all-of-the-above approach. We have to have an approach that's focused on renewables, and there was a 5-fold increase in renewable investment in Australia in 2016 compared to 2015. We have to have standards around our appliances and the built environment to reduce emissions. And we have
Josh,
to
I'm
do
going to have to bring
things.
you to an end here. I'm sorry about that. We have time. We really are running out of time. We've got time for one last question. We should get to it. It's from Jasmine Kinderis. Go ahead.
Australia is one of the most developed nations in the world. However, we are still denied the right to marry who we love. The Constitution of Australia prevents the Commonwealth from establishing any religion, yet Conservative politicians, usually with religious ties, are the ones denying the right to equality. Why is our Conservative government trying to keep Australia from same-sex marriage?
Yeah, I'm going to start. Thank you. I'll start with Jock. I saw you applauding that question, and some people might find that strange that you're a country boy from a Conservative background. What do you say?
Well, yes, I'm a country kid, but Mum and I were talking about this before. It shouldn't matter who you love, to be honest. As long as you are a decent person, you're understanding, you abide by the laws, you just do everything as you can to be a good person, it shouldn't matter who you love. And that means no one should be able to say you cannot marry them. What goes on behind closed doors in another person's house is no one else's business but theirs. So for someone else to say that's not acceptable is just criminally unfair, really. So I believe that.
Since you're on the subject, very briefly, do you think this should be resolved by the Parliament with a simple up and down vote, or should it go out to a plebiscite to the whole voting public?
I think it's only fair if it goes out to the voting public, because that gets you a broader range of opinions, whereas in the Parliament, you'd still get a broad range of opinions, but it's just a lot more condensed. So I think it's only fair if it goes out to the public and they decide.
All right, Jacinta.
I agree with you on so many points, Jock, but I don't agree that we should have a plebiscite or a postal vote, as Peter Dutton was talking about. The country is clear. We want marriage equality, and to try and engage in this plebiscite or postal vote, which would only stir up so much hateful rhetoric and angry rhetoric, I think would be detrimental to all of us. You know, it's something that we're lagging behind all other developed countries, all over the world. We need to take action on marriage equality.
Aretha.
We're at this point now where I'm pretty sure, you know, the consensus amongst young people is that we want marriage equality and we need love, because, you know, no man and no woman, you know, knows exactly who they are, and, you know, at this point, we need love because... I'm sorry, there's something, it hits really close to home, being part of this kind of community, understanding that there are some people that aren't going to agree with what you have to say. You kind of have to realise that, you know, love is where you find it, love is where, you know, it will carry you, and that you need it, because I think a person is left dangerous if they don't have love, because it teaches you humanity and it teaches you how to suffer. And to think that there's certain people out there that, you know, they don't have the same rights as, you know, a person sitting next to you. It's just, you know, this is supposed to be Australia in the 21st century, for crying out loud. And yet I couldn't marry someone if I really love them. And I just think that's, you know, we say we're progressive, but at the same time, I'm kind of left, you know, kind of broken when I think about it.
Let's hear from all of our young panellists on this. Pinidu.
Personally, I think we should have a plebiscite, because everyone needs to have a say. When you are doing something as fundamental as changing the definition of marriage, something this fundamental, there is no going back. Once you do it, that's it. And I think everyone has to have a say on this, and I strongly support a plebiscite. Because, as Jock mentioned before, in Parliament you have 150 members who might not represent all the views in Australia. And another thing I'd like to mention is, if a parliamentary vote were to go ahead, there's always a chance that political interference could come into this. In a plebiscite, every Australian votes in a private voting booth where they get their chance to have their say. And then, as the current Liberal government has promised, they will go with whatever the outcome of the plebiscite is. So I strongly support a plebiscite on this issue.
I'm just going to quickly go back to our questioner, Jasmine. What do you think?
So in the 2017-18 budget, the government has actually allowed for, I believe it's $1.8 million into the plebiscite, even though society, well, not society, the youth know that it was a catastrophic failure last year.
I think it's 170 million.
Sorry,
yeah,
my
that's
apologies.
Right. That's okay.
But if you bring the plebiscite into this, you're leaving minorities such as, you know, trans people, bisexual people, gay people, everyone. They're open to, you know, discrimination. This is something I hold entirely close to my heart because it hits far too close to home. I'm from regional Victoria, so I live about 3 hours away. And in regional Victoria, we're more accepting. When you come down to Melbourne, you just see people giving you weird looks, giving my friends weird looks on trams. And then in regional Victoria, it's just like, oh, you're gay, that's cool, whatever, let's keep going. So you can open it to the plebiscite, you can open it to the public, but in reality, it didn't work. And you're just opening everybody to attack people who don't need that. And you're denying people the right to love. I completely respect your views, your opinions, your values. Everybody is valid. But if people are going to be openly abused in public because they're holding hands, that's pretty disgusting.
Josh, just a quick one on this, and I'll put it as a question since we've heard about love here. Why is it okay for the Parliament to decide on war but not on love?
Well, we made it very clear that we would go to the election with a plebiscite policy, and dare I say, if the Parliament had voted for the plebiscite, based on the polls today, we would have gay marriage in this country, and I personally support that. The issue here is that we took a policy and that we want the public to have its say. And when we did say that back in 2013, even Bill Shorten was supportive of that. So I think we can allow the Australian people to have their say. And I think you made a very good point there, which was you respect the passion that people have on this view, on these views. And there are people who are very passionate against, just as there are very many people who are passionate for. And I have great confidence in the Australian people to be able to debate these issues. And once it's done, it's done.
OK, very quick response from Catherine King.
You've changed policies all the time. I don't know why you won't change your policy on this, frankly. We should just get this done.
OK. There's an entire 1 hour or longer political debate we could have at this moment, but we haven't got time. We've run out of time. Please thank our panel: Jock Maddern, Catherine King, Pinidu Chandrasekera, Aretha Brown, Josh Frydenberg, Jacinta Speer, and this great audience. Hey. So, thank you. Now, tonight's Q&A was an experiment, and I venture to say a very successful one, our first high school special. But with so many students from across Australia keen to join the audience and the panel, we're looking forward to taking this experiment around the country. So remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and Katie Atchison of Youth Action New South Wales. They'll be taking comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish. Next week on Q&A, Trade Minister Steve Chobo, Shadow Finance Minister Jim Chalmers, Chinese-American author and journalist Mei Fong, Foreign Affairs Editor at The Australian Greg Sheridan, and Senior Economics Writer for Fairfax Media Jessica Irvine. Until then, good night.
ABC News Radio and Facebook Live.
Do you think I'm a right fit for this job?
What? What's this all about?
My performance